Welcome to your personalized deep dive. We're going to be exploring something super fascinating today, genetic ancestry in the United States.
Really looking forward to
So
this.
get ready to kind of uncover, how much what we say about our heritage actually matches up with what our DNA says.
Yeah. You know what's so interesting about the U.S. is its history of migration and mixing, right?
Yeah,
It's like this giant genetic puzzle with all these pieces from different continents coming together over centuries.
it's true.
Today, we're going to see what happens when we try to piece it all together.
I love that analogy. Okay, so for this deep dive, we're going to be taking a look at a 2010 scientific paper.
Okay.
It's from the journal Human Mutation, and the title is pretty dense.
All right.
It's called Evaluating Self-Declared Ancestry of U.S. Americans with Autosomal, Y-chromosomal and Mitochondrial DNA.
Catchy.
I know, right? So you probably already know that DNA holds like all the secrets to our ancestry.
Right.
But this study uses three specific types. So autosomal DNA, which comes from both of your parents. Then you've got Y-chromosomal DNA, which is passed down through the paternal line.
Mm-hmm.
And then mitochondrial DNA, which comes from your mother's side.
So it's kind of like having three different lenses to look at ancestry.
That's a good way to put it.
Each one's telling like a slightly different story.
Right.
And by combining all three, we can get a much richer understanding of how different ancestral groups contributed to like the genetic makeup of people and populations.
That makes a lot of sense. So this study, it focused on four major self-identified groups in the U.S.
Okay.
You've got African Americans, Hispanic Americans, European Americans, and Asian Americans.
All right, makes sense. Those are some pretty big groups.
Yeah. And to kind of pinpoint their continental origins, the researchers use something called ancestry-sensitive markers, or ASMs for short.
Okay, I've heard of those. Can you remind me what those are again?
Yeah, so basically think of them as specific segments of DNA that act like genetic flags.
Okay.
Let's say you have a certain ASM that's really common in people of European descent,
Yeah.
but it's rare in other populations.
Yeah.
If you do a DNA test and it reveals that you have that marker, it suggests you have European ancestors in your family tree.
Interesting.
So researchers have identified like a whole bunch of these ASMs that are specific to different continents.
Wow.
And this allows them to trace back ancestral roots with pretty good accuracy.
That's amazing.
So it's not just about looking at your parents' DNA, but using these markers to go way back in time.
Right.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's really neat.
But, the real heart of the study is the comparison between self-declared ancestry, so how people identify themselves,
Mm-hmm.
and then their genetic ancestry, so what their DNA reveals.
And that comparison, that's where things get really interesting.
Totally.
It's about understanding how self-perception and objective data from DNA analysis, like how well do those two things actually align? Do people accurately perceive their own ancestral origins, especially in a country like the U.S., with such a complex history of migration and mixing?
Yeah, it's a huge question.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that there were some kind of unexpected findings in this research.
Yeah.
What were some of the things that surprised the researchers the most?
One of the most intriguing things was the variation in how closely self-reported ancestry actually matched up with genetic ancestry across different groups.
Okay.
So for European Americans, African Americans, and Asian Americans, there was a pretty strong correlation.
Okay.
But for Hispanic Americans, the study revealed a much more diverse ancestry profile,
Interesting.
really reflecting the complex and kind of layered history of Latin America.
I already see how this deep dive is like challenging all those simple assumptions about race and ethnicity.
Yeah, it really gets you thinking.
But before we kind of jump into the specific findings for each group,
Yeah,
can you explain one more thing for me?
sure.
The paper mentioned something called an MDS plot,
Yes.
and it talks about how it shows a lot of diversity among the U.S. Hispanic population.
Right.
Can you unpack that for us?
Absolutely. So an MDS plot, or multidimensional scaling plot, it's basically a visual way to represent the genetic relationships between individuals and populations.
Okay.
Imagine like a map where each dot on the map represents a person.
Okay.
The closer the dots are to each other, the more genetically similar those people are.
Makes sense.
So in the MDS plot from this study, some U.S. Hispanics were clustered close to European Americans, while others were closer to Asian Americans.
Wow. So there's like a lot of variation.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And some even showed a mix of European and African ancestry. The fact that the dots were spread out so much means there's like a huge range of ancestral combinations within that U.S. Hispanic population.
So it sounds like the MBS plot is a really powerful tool to see the genetic diversity within a group,
It is.
something that you might miss if you just focus on averages.
Absolutely.
So we've got 3 different types of DNA ancestry-sensitive markers and a visual tool to help us understand this genetic tapestry of the U.S.
It's a lot to take in.
I know. I'm ready to dive into the results.
Let's do it.
Where do we start? Let's start with those like average continental ancestry proportions that they found in the study.
Oh.
I imagine like the results for European Americans were pretty straightforward.
You'd think so, right? The study found that their autosomal DNA showed an average of 93.2% European ancestry.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, which makes sense considering that their origins are primarily from European settlers.
Okay,
But here's where it gets a bit more interesting. That remaining 6.8%,
okay.
it actually represents trace amounts of other continental ancestries.
So like what could that be?
Perhaps Native American, African, or Asian?
Okay, so there's still some mixing in there.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even within a group that seems homogeneous on the surface, there's actually hidden genetic diversity.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And remember, this is just an average, right?
Right.
Some individuals might have even more diverse ancestry than others.
So it's not just about the major ancestry group, but those subtle mixes that tell a more nuanced story.
Yeah.
Okay, so what about the Asian Americans in the
Yeah.
study? Did they show a similar pattern?
Yes, they did.
Okay.
Their average East Asian ancestry was 89.5%.
Wow. Pretty high.
Yeah, which aligns with their self-declared ancestry.
Okay.
But again, that remaining percentage kind of hints at some level of mixing with other populations over time.
So it's always more complex than it seems at first.
Always.
Okay. Shifting gears a little bit now to African Americans.
Okay.
What did the study reveal about their continental ancestry?
The study found that on average, African Americans had 86.2% sub-Saharan African ancestry.
That's actually higher than I would have guessed.
Yeah, and it's higher than some people might expect given the history of, the transatlantic slave trade and mixing with European populations in the U.S.
Yeah, it makes you think about how much we assume about someone's ancestry based on appearance or self-identification,
It's true.
which can be misleading.
Yeah, absolutely.
Were there any regional differences within the African American group?
Yes, and this is where we start to see how regional history can really shape genetic heritage.
I like that.
The study found significant variations in the amount of African ancestry among African Americans,
Okay.
depending on where in the U.S. they were from.
Interesting.
For example, those from South Carolina showed a higher proportion of African ancestry compared to those from Louisiana.
Wow. So even within a certain region of the U.S., you see these differences.
Yeah, this difference really highlights how even within a single racial category, genetic heritage can reflect the unique impact of historical events on different communities.
It's amazing how genetics can uncover those fine-grained details about the past.
Yeah, it's like a historical record.
Now let's talk about the U.S. Hispanic population.
Okay.
We didn't know that they had the most diverse ancestry profiles.
Right.
What were the specific proportions?
Okay, so on average, U.S. Hispanics in the study showed 61.2% European ancestry, 14.9% Native American ancestry,
Oh, wait.
11.6% Sub-Saharan African ancestry,
Right.
and 10.8% East Asian ancestry.
That's a real mix.
Right.
It really underscores that idea we were talking about earlier that Hispanic is more of a cultural and linguistic designation
Yeah.
than a strictly genetic one.
Exactly. And their ancestry reflects this complex history of interactions between different populations in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Right.
You can see how those different layers of history show up on that MDS plot we discussed. with
Yeah.
Individuals scattered across different areas reflecting these various degrees of admixture.
And did the study find regional variations within the U.S. Hispanic population as well?
Absolutely.
Okay.
For instance, Hispanics from Miami had a higher proportion of Cuban ancestry,
Okay.
while those from the Southwest showed greater Native American ancestry.
Interesting.
It's just another reminder that migration patterns and historical events play a huge role in shaping regional genetic diversity,
Yeah.
creating a really complex mosaic across the U.S.
Okay, so far we've looked at overall ancestry percentages, but this study actually went deeper than that. They used Y-chromosomal and mitochondrial DNA to look at ancestry passed down specifically through the maternal and paternal lines.
Yeah, that's a great way to get more detail.
What did those analyses reveal?
That's where we start to uncover the story of sex-biased admixture.
Okay.
a story that often reflects some pretty uncomfortable historical realities.
Oh,
So the researchers found significant differences in the ancestry proportions
okay.
for U.S. African Americans and U.S. Hispanics
Hmm.
when comparing their Y-chromosomal DNA, which comes from fathers, to their mitochondrial DNA, which comes from mothers.
This raises some uncomfortable questions about historical power dynamics.
Yeah, for sure.
And how those shape genetic legacies.
It's a heavy topic.
Did the researchers find similar patterns in other groups?
Not really. It seems like those patterns were really specific to those populations with a history of, forced migration and social inequality.
So tell me, what did they see specifically in the U.S. African American population when they looked at those sex-specific ancestries?
Okay, so for U.S. African Americans, the Y chromosomal DNA, which is passed down directly from father to son,
Right.
showed significantly more European ancestry than their mitochondrial DNA,
Okay.
which traces back through the maternal line and was predominantly of African origin.
Interesting.
This pattern, it really points to a historical reality
Yeah.
where European men fathered children with African women,
Right.
a pattern that aligns with the power imbalances and exploitation that characterize slavery and its aftermath.
It's a heavy but important topic to talk about.
Yeah, it's not easy to confront, but these genetic findings, they force us to acknowledge these difficult truths.
Absolutely. Did the researchers uncover any sex bias patterns in the U.S. Hispanic population as well?
They did, but the patterns for U.S. Hispanics were a bit more complex.
Okay.
They still pointed to this significant sex bias admixture, though.
Okay.
They showed a really strong European male contribution to the gene pool,
Mm-hmm.
along with a considerable Native American female contribution.
It's like pieces of a historical puzzle coming together.
Exactly. And this likely reflects the dynamics that played out during the Spanish colonization of the Americas.
Right. It's amazing how these genetic analyses can give us that window into those historical power dynamics and social forces.
It's a powerful tool for understanding history.
But I think it's important to pause for a moment and let these findings sink in for our listeners.
Yeah, take a moment.
Imagine what it means to carry these genetic markers, these echoes of the past, within your very cells.
It's incredible.
It's such a profound connection to history.
It really is. And, it prompts us to consider how those historical events continue to influence social dynamics and identities today.
That's so true.
It's not just about the past, it's about understanding the present as well.
I completely agree. Now let's turn to that other intriguing finding from the study.
Okay.
The one about skin color and self-identification.
Right.
This is where things get even more interesting.
Absolutely. The researchers discovered something super fascinating about two specific genetic markers related to skin pigmentation.
So these markers didn't behave as expected when they compared the U.S. groups to their continental counterparts.
That's right.
So we're talking about genes that affect how much melanin someone produces,
Yeah,
which then determines how light or dark their skin is.
exactly.
What did they find?
Okay, so you have these two genes called OCA2 and SLC45A2.
Okay.
Both of which play a key role in determining skin pigmentation.
Mm-hmm.
Variations in these genes can lead to a wide spectrum of skin colors.
Right.
What the researchers discovered was that in U.S. African Americans, a specific variation in the OCA2 gene.
Okay.
It was much more informative than expected in differentiating them from European populations.
And the OCA2 gene is the one linked to darker skin tones.
Yes.
Exactly. So let me make sure I'm following this correctly.
Sure.
If someone had that specific variation in the OCA2 gene, even if they had a large amount of European ancestry, they were still more likely to be identified as African American.
Precisely. It seems that having that particular genetic marker,
The one associated with darker skin color.
yeah, it really played a role in how people were categorized.
Wow.
Even if their overall genetic ancestry told a more mixed story.
That is a fascinating finding. It suggests that self-identity, particularly when it comes to race, is so much more nuanced than we might assume.
I agree. It's not just about ancestry. It's about how you're perceived by others. And visible traits like skin color can have a huge influence on that perception.
Absolutely. Well, after this deep dive, I think it's safe to say that genetic ancestry is anything but simple.
For sure. There's so much more to uncover.
What are some of the key takeaways you hope our listener walks away with today?
Well, first and foremost, I'd say self-declared ancestry is a good starting point, and it generally aligns with genetic ancestry, especially for European Americans, Asian Americans, and African Americans.
Yeah.
But for U.S. Hispanics, the story is more complex and fascinating, reflecting that rich history of admixture in Latin America.
Right, and we learned that examining those different types of DNA can reveal hidden layers of history.
Right, like the sex-biased admixture.
Exactly, and that's evident in both the U.S. African American and U.S. Hispanic populations.
It really highlights how historical events and social forces can shape the genetic makeup of populations.
Yeah, and lastly, we saw how visual traits like skin color can have a big influence on self-identification, sometimes even more so than deeper genetic ancestry.
It's a really thought-provoking finding.
It challenges us to think about how we categorize people and how much weight we give to visible traits versus, someone's genetic heritage or their own self-perception.
It's a complex issue for sure.
This has been such an illuminating deep dive.
I agree. Thanks for having me.
Before we go, we want to leave you with a final thought.
Okay.
We encourage you to think about the most surprising finding from this deep dive
Yeah.
and how it might challenge your own assumptions about identity.
It's a good exercise.
Maybe even consider doing a DNA test yourself to see what stories your genes tell.
You never know what you might find.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time, keep exploring.